Swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Narrative essays are common assignments that are given in composition classes, but they're really different from other kinds of essays. They're really structured very differently. And the truth is that narrative essays, as entire essays, don't really have much of a place in most academic or professional writing. Now, that isn't to say they have none. They do sometimes have some place, but most of the time they don't have a lot of place. Because most of the time you're not telling stories, and the kinds of skills that go into narrative essays have a lot of overlap with the kinds of skills in writing fiction. Although obviously in the case of narrative essays, these should be nonfiction in most cases. That being said, although the writing of a narrative essay itself is a kind of artificial assignment, an assignment to do something that you're not going to be asked to do much outside of the classroom. The skills that you develop in that are important for use in other kinds of essays. So what do I mean when I say artificial? Well, most of the time when we think about these assignments that you're given in composition classes, you're not likely to walk into a situation where in your work where someone says, write this thing on this subject. So let me give you a story from my own life. So one time some years ago, we had an author who was visiting, and I'm not going to name the author because I don't much care for her work. Nice person, didn't care for her work. So there was this luncheon that everyone went to. And I didn't go to it. First, because I wasn't that interested in her work. I started reading it and I didn't care for it. And then I was just really busy. And so I let the people who were interested in her work go to her luncheon, and I did things in the office. Well, I got a call from the chancellor's office saying, you are the only person in the department. We need someone to write up an introduction of her for the chancellor because he has to introduce her at lunch. And there was I said, well, I don't know anything about her. I read this book and I didn't care for it, so I don't know what you want me to say. And the secretary who was talking to me said, well, you're the only person. And I said, well, look at the time. That means that I, have an hour, less than an hour, only 40 minutes to do this in. And she said, oh, no. We need it earlier than that because we needed to prepare it for him. And she gave me a time, and I realized that was 20 minutes I had to research her life, an introduction to her, and to write it. Now, this is a kind of workplace situation that lots of people have had. You're not planning to do a presentation on something, but as it turns out, the guys from corporate stayed too long, or a client is just blown into town, or something got shifted around in a schedule and you have to change things up. They didn't say, we want you to write an in-class essay on this subject. You have 20 minutes. But that was really the skills that I used, the same skills I used for writing in-class essays. And so narrative essays are about telling stories. And the skills of telling stories, the idea of writing a narrative essay, that's not likely to happen. But the storytelling skill you'll use a lot. I just used the storytelling skill here today to explain that to you. But in writing, you'll use it a little more sparingly for professional and scholarly writing. But it does come up often as illustrations, and sometimes we see it in introductions or conclusions where you're kind of laying out a situation for the reader. So the skills of narrative essays are really important skills, even if you think, well, I'm never going to write something that looks exactly like a narrative essay. You will, in fact, write, a one-paragraph story of a thing that happened, an illustration of this, an illustration of that. These sorts of things happen all the time. So, how do you write a good one? Well, there are all sorts of, there are so many things to say about this, but I would stress two parts. The first one is make sure you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now that seems obvious, but we all know people who tell stories that either don't seem to have an end to them. They go on and on and on, and by the time they're done, you don't even remember what the story was about. Or they don't really know what the beginning is. They'll say, well, here's a situation, and they begin to tell the story, and they say, well, to understand that, you have to understand what happened before, and then they're explaining the context of that thing that came before, and then they're saying, well, you have to know, and they're going back and back and back, and they didn't start in the middle. And then, of course, they didn't start at the beginning, and then there's the middle, and the middle often is not fleshed out. So every so often you have someone who tells a story, and they tell you the beginning, and they tell you the end, but you can't figure out how they got from point A to point C. Point B was skipped over altogether. And so you want to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in most cases, you want to keep it pretty short. Now, obviously, a narrative essay, if it's an assignment, you'll be given a certain amount of space. But most of the time in a professional or scholarly setting, you're either giving an anecdote that's going to be a paragraph or less, or you're giving a very short illustration. And so in most cases, if it's a kind of anecdote, you literally will have a 3-sentence story. Sentence 1 will be the beginning. Sentence 2 will be the middle or the meat of it. And sentence 3 will be the end of it. And of course, there are varying lengths depending on the length of the thing that you're dealing with. So that would be one thing, is make sure your stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if that sounds too simple to you, just remember, lots of people who don't do that and how tedious their stories are. Now, what's the other one? Now, this is the harder one, I think, to think about. And that is a general rule for writing, but it's especially important for narrative writing. And the rule is, let your nouns and your verbs do the work for you. Let your nouns and your verbs do the work for you. That's kind of mysterious sounding. But basically, it's a kind of rule for any kind of writing where you don't want to use a lot of adjectives and adverbs. Sometimes you'll see these internet memes where they say, here are some things you would want to use instead of very. Use extremely or tremendously or greatly. Well, you're basically just saying very over and over again. Really good writers will avoid those kinds of intensifiers because they want those kinds of intensifiers to be in the nouns and verbs themselves. And by the way, this is not just true for English. This is true in any language that you're writing in. The real meat of any writing is in the nouns and verbs. So what am I saying here in specifics? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say that I want to say that I'm maybe writing about a game, sports, and I want to say that some athlete ran fast across the field. Well, inexperienced writer will say he ran fast. He ran very fast. He ran extremely fast. He ran tremendously fast. But there are all sorts of, but the problem is all you're doing is you're changing the fast. Maybe go to quick. Again, very quickly. That's not as visually understanding and descriptive as if you change the verb ran. Good writers will try to take the adverb and fold it into the verb, or the adjective and fold it into the noun. What do I mean by that? So don't say he ran fast. Get rid of ran fast and pick one verb that means ran fast. Don't say he ran fast across the field. Say he zoomed across the field. He bolted across the field. He dashed across the field. He galloped across the field. I mean, there are so many options. Each of them is far more engaging, creates a visual image in many cases, and ultimately then is much more satisfying for the reader rather than adding more adjectives and adverbs. So get rid of your descriptive words whenever possible, but don't just eliminate them. Fold their meaning into a better noun or a better verb choice than the one you're doing. And this will make all of your writing better, but will especially make your narrative and other sorts of descriptive writing better. So let me give you one more example. There's the famous, bad opening. It was a dark and stormy night. Well, you can say that the night was dark, but the problem with that, aside from the clear redundancy, I suppose the meaning is supposed to be, well, it was an especially dark night, right? That's kind of what the author maybe intends to say in this sentence. Well, in that case, you might think, well, how do I say especially dark? It was a pitch black night. It was really, really dark. It was very dark. It was, maybe you could say it was an obsidian night. It was a jet black night. But in the end, because you're just using the descriptor anyway, the verb is in this case, which is not a great verb to use. There's very little you seem to be able to do with that. But if you say like, okay, I'm going to make sure that my nouns and verbs do the work, and I'm going to try to remove the word dark altogether from it, this forces you to do something that would be much more descriptive and ornate in the good way. Okay. So instead of saying it was a very dark night, or it was a dark and stormy night, you might say something like, the night was a canvas thrown over the sky, blocking out the stars, so not even the smallest light escaped. Okay. That's overwrought, okay, because I'm coming up with it off the top of my head for your little video here. I probably could have planned something better. But the point is that in doing that, it forced me to do something that was far more visual and far more descriptive than just say the night was dark or the night was stormy. By doing that, I've given it a lot more life. And so it's not about writing more words. It's about your words being more descriptive and more impactful. And so there are so many things to be said about writing a narrative essay or really writing any kind of essay. But the two things I would say always remember is, first, make sure you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end to any small anecdote. Of course, a narrative essay, your beginning is the introduction, the body is the middle, and then the conclusion's the end. And then make your nouns and your verbs do the real work. Wherever possible, get rid of adjectives and adverbs, get rid of those description words, and use more descriptive nouns and verbs.